Mistress here again, and you're watching Dangerously Rockin' Reviews! Pretty much every decade or so, popular music has gone through many changes. Some of them were a stroke of genius, while others kinda sucked. So, here's my ranking of all the musical decades from the worst to the best. Although by all, I mean the ones ranging from the 50s to today, because that's when songs started to define certain eras.
The worst decade for music is...
I hate to spoil your good time, folks, but the 2010s. We're living in, without a doubt, the worst time to be a seeker of new music. I mean, sure, you'll get a good tune the odd time, but most of it is just crap. It's either a bunch of obnoxious auto-tuned electropop, or else it's that lame-ass, non-threatening indie pop, a lot of which is also electronic asset heavy. Let's not forget that, different form of country. I just don't understand the appeal of these songs. Like, there's literally nothing dazzling or even compelling about most of them. And I'm like, the best day of your life? Getting drunk on a Saturday night? That's the best you people can come up with?
Bunch of wankers.
When the only songs from this decade that blew you away came from legendary musicians from the past, or from Japan, it really says a lot about today's artists' integrity. I only hope that the 2020s can turn things around and offer us some music that's actually worthwhile. Although, given all the technology that's available to us now, that's doubtful. But on the other hand, I can't imagine the songs of tomorrow getting any worse than this. And they are slowly starting to get better, but remember, slowly.
Number 6!
The 2000s. Now, to their credit, the songs from that decade didn't start off all that bad. It had some decent pop-punk tunes as well as some great hard rock and heavy metal songs. But by about 2005, 2006 or so, things took a rapid downward spiral, even spawning the worst song of all time. Artists began moving away from electric guitars and drum sets in favor of electropop backing tracks, and the auto-tune craze just got completely out of control. It doesn't help that American Idol came along at the start of the decade, along with digital downloads that would more or less destroy the record industry. Man, we really ruined things for future generations, didn't we? The 2000s also proved to be the last era in which we'd get great new rock and roll bands, and the last time we'd get a song as spectacular as War Pigs or Welcome to the Jungle. So yeah, while the music from that decade isn't quite as bad as the stuff from today, it still had a lot of terrible songs. So I'd say the late 2000s, early 2010s were what I like to call the dark age for music.
Number 5!
The 1950s. I had to include this one because if it wasn't for Elvis or Chuck Berry or Little Richard, none of our favorite bands would have existed. They were the founding fathers of rock and roll. The only problem is that a lot of their songs were written around novelties that were popular at the time. I mean, they were good, and I even found myself grooving along to them. But they just didn't have that depth or emotion that songs from later decades would have. I don't know, maybe it had something to do with the lyrical and melodic conventions that they stuck to. The only artist I can think of whose songs didn't feel like a product of their time was Screamin' Jay Hawkins. If I didn't know better, I'd say his voice and delivery were the precursor to what would become heavy metal in the 70s. I mean, why do you think they call him Screamin' Jay Hawkins?
You're mine! Wow, yeah!
There was a lot of pioneering going on in the music scene in those days, but you have to understand that pioneering doesn't always mean perfection, and most of these songs don't do much for me. That said, I still appreciate them for trying something different.
Number 4!
The 1960s. This was where music took an entirely different direction. More and more artists began to turn away from jazz and teeny bop in favor of that basic guitars, bass, and drum sound that's since become standard. and you only had about like 4 or 5 players in each band, sometimes 3, instead of those big bands from before. A lot of those cheesy teeny bop aspects from the 50s that I'm not much for did carry over into some of these songs, like that of the Beach Boys and the Beatles' early material, but it was the late 60s when the music started to get really good. Their lyrics and structures became much more interesting, and even the recording quality had improved, which is why they still sound fresh today. But the best songs still had yet to come, which is why I didn't put this decade higher on the list.
Number 3!
The 1990s. While the 60s was the first great decade for music, the 90s was what I consider the last. At least during the first half. Because I will admit, by the late 90s, music was starting to lose its edge, with an even greater focus on pop melodies than what we'd experienced since the 50s. They just weren't as fun to listen to anymore. I mean, sure, you could argue that Kurt Cobain's suicide was what led to the decline of rock and roll, and if he was still alive, Nirvana could have helped keep the fun going. But I think they hit their stride when Nevermind came out. And even if he hadn't killed himself, they probably would have either broken up, burnt out, or changed musical direction. But when the songs of the 90s were good, they were really good. They were still experimental, still rebellious, and in some cases emotional and thought-provoking, but with a slacker's approach. You felt like these artists were doing what they wanted to do without compromise, and for the most part, it paid off. I may be a millennial, but when it comes to youth-oriented songs, I feel a far greater connection to the 90s bands than I ever will to those from my generation.
Number 2!
The 1980s. This was a time when synthesizers and big booming drum sounds were all the rage, and what an exciting time too. Because alongside glam metal and new wave, you also had 2 other great musical genres, and those were AOR and thrash metal. Goddamn thrash metal, dude! And you had Guns N' Roses too. So let me get this straight. This is the decade that gets all the criticism for using electronic sounds, when the 2000s and the 2010s have been doing the exact same thing, and everybody's just okay with that? Okay, whatever. But it's not like I don't get where those criticisms are coming from, cause yeah, those synth bands use them quite a lot. And I much prefer the songs that Metallica, Iron Maiden, and Slayer made. But to the credit of the more popular acts of the time, their songs were jam-packed with energy and charisma, most of the time. And since autotune hadn't been invented back then, thank God, you knew these guys had talent. And to make the decade even more interesting, alternative rock was starting to come about. It wouldn't become mainstream until the 90s, but it was getting there. So you have a decade filled with fun and diversity, and where a lot of my favorite bands had their heyday. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what could.
And the best decade for music is...
The 1970s. If you grew up during the era where most of the greatest bands of all time ruled the music world, consider yourself lucky. I mean, sure, the 80s had tons of fun songs and more badass bands, but the songs of the 70s had everything. Most of my favorite bands peaked in this era. You had Aerosmith, Black Sabbath, AC/DC with Bon Scott, Deep Purple, Queen, Rush, The Who, Leonard Skinner, Pink Floyd, Kiss, Van Halen, ZZ Top, yes! And of course, Santana. Not only were they extremely gifted players and singers, but their songs were just really, really top notch. Even the pop songs, except for that one song from Grease, were really good. They were experimental, they were emotional, and in most cases, full of conviction. I guarantee you won't find any of that in the average 2010s tune, unless it's J-pop. I mean, you don't need computers or good looks to make a great song. Those things come from the heart. And the artists of the 70s knew that all too well. And that's why I look up to them. Not just as a musician, but as a person too. They were what got me through my teenage years. Well, them and those classic bands from other decades. But that's why the 70s was the best decade in music history and will probably never be topped by any other era after the 2010s. I'm the Fantastic Mr. S, and you're watching Dangerously Rockin' Reviews!